Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Annette Oltmans, founder and CEO of the M3ND Project. Thank you for joining us for this month's training intensive. The topic is gender bias, how it harms us all. Every month at the M3ND Project, we offer a free training intensive so that we can take a deeper look into a specific topic. You can find recordings of prior intensives on our Facebook page or our YouTube channel. And if you subscribe to our newsletter on our website, you will get advance notice of all of our training programs, our blog, and other ways you can be involved with M3ND. If there are topics that you would like to see us cover, please share them with us, because we will share them at info@themendproject.com, because we love to hear from you and we love to get ideas for more things to talk about. The M3ND Project, just in case for some of you who don't know, is a nonprofit organization that I founded in 2016 to educate, to equip, and to restore all those impacted by abuse. We teach survivors, we teach responders, therapists, faith-based leaders, and other nonprofits about the complexities of psychological abuse and trauma, and how to respond to victims correctly in order to prevent double abuse. Double abuse is a term I coined to describe the secondary harm that often occurs when a victim reaches out for help, but is inadvertently or sometimes intentionally harmed by those that the victim placed their trust in. For example, victims are often, they tell their story, but they're often not believed, or they are judged, or they're criticized and given incorrect instructions. They might be harshly interrogated, with pointed and leading questions with a lot of doubt imposed on the victim, and they can even be blamed for the abuse. These are forms of double abuse. Before we get into today's topic, I want to share about our next training. It's on March 25th, and we will be holding a space for victims and survivors of abuse, or anyone who is struggling in a high conflict relationship, to participate in this training cohort. Don't worry, all live sessions will be done in webinar format in order to protect the anonymity, the confidentiality of our participants. During this upcoming training, we will go through our M3ND Responding to Abuse curriculum. This is a 7-week interactive online course where we will teach you all about emotional abuse, trauma, double abuse, and many other related topics that will help you gain a lot of additional clarity and hopefully healing on your journey. To register, simply visit our website at themendproject.com, where you can learn more or register. And for this specific training, we are offering full and partial scholarships. So if you're interested, then please email us and let us know that you would like a scholarship at info@themendproject.com. Today, we're going to talk about gender bias. Gender bias is a hot topic these days, and it creates many different responses when people hear about it. There's so much under the umbrella. And so oftentimes what pops in your mind when you hear the phrase of gender bias, you think of things like what? Sexism, feminism, toxic masculinity, toxic femininity. All of these things can cause a response in you, like a defensive response maybe, or a passionate response to promote a certain idea. Some of you may cringe, others might celebrate. Whatever your response, we thought it important to uncover some of the ways our assumptions about gender stereotypes can impact others. Gender bias and even the cultural gender stereotypes we often forget exist within us, and work to sustain and encourage ongoing abuse. And they can shut victims down, whether they are male or female, these biases that we carry. And they can cause those who are responding to abused people to speak and act in ways that are harmful instead of helping victims during their greatest time of need. So these biases can inadvertently affect the way responders treat victims, based on their viewpoints about gender stereotypes or just gender equality or inequality. It will have an impact one way or the other when they interface with victims of abuse. Unconscious biases are present in all aspects of our lives. We categorize the world around us for many reasons. It makes it feel less complicated or overwhelming. It can help us feel better about ourselves or our circumstances. It can help our brains to create order and make sense of our world. Sometimes those biases can lead us to form ideas about other people or other groups of people that result in inequity or prejudice, discrimination based on gender, based on religion, based on ethnicity, race, education, socioeconomic status, and so on. Gender bias is when one gender is given preference over another, or it could be that it's given a lesser, it's not considered equal to one gender. So it can play both ways. It can result in behavior that shows favoritism to one gender while putting the other gender in an inferior position. It is a type of blinder or bias that happens when someone unconsciously attributes certain attitudes and ideas and beliefs to another person or group of people. And those ascribed attributes then shape and impact how we understand others and engage with others. So it's when we make conclusions about a situation, about a thing, or about a person because of what we are assuming or believing about them based on our gender-based opinions. From that, incorrect presumptions or conclusions are often the result. So I hope that made sense to you. That was a mouthful. Excuse me. A classic example of this is when someone dismisses a female who is crying uncontrollably because they assume it's nothing, because girls are just overly emotional, or perhaps she's hormonal, or when a man acts violently, bracing himself to fight, we limit his response to it being just the way men are, and it's just manly, and anger is an appropriate emotion for men, as opposed to when a woman is angry, then she's a bitch. So it's just something, we give a pass for anger rather than recognizing it as a possible, maybe it's, we give a pass and consider it a male attribute rather than considering that maybe the gentleman needs to fight, maybe he needs to protect himself, or his actions may be due to being triggered by something that he's seen or experienced, a reaction possibly to a real fear that comes out of trauma from something he has experienced in the past. So it can go both ways in this situation as well. In each of these scenarios, our presumptions could possibly be accurate or partially accurate. However, one should never reach conclusions or opinions based on a gender qualifying or disqualifying presumption, or we will cause harm and miss key opportunities to uncover factual information and see things holistically and help us to serve others. Our biases, in other words, then impact our ability to see clearly what is actually happening. We need to be curious and we need to explore as opposed to judge based on our biases. To bring more clarity and light into these biases within the field of intimate partner violence, I will share more specifically how gender bias impacts male victims, impacts female victims, and how it is a disservice to the one who is causing harm. And it's not just a disservice to the one who is causing harm, it's a disservice to the one who is experiencing harm. And finally, how gender bias happens in the form of double abuse, which I mentioned briefly when we opened this talk. So how does gender bias impact male victims? First off, many of you may think there are no male victims, but 1 in 7 experiencing abuse are male. So we do know that there's still significant numbers of men who are experiencing abuse. So let's just talk about that for a second. People often think of gender bias as it pertains to the preferential treatment men are given, sometimes in the workplace, for example, or they are promoted to higher positions than women within the same skill set and experience, or they are paid more than a woman with the same job title and experience. Even when there is conflict, a man's beliefs or position might be given greater consideration and value than a female's, simply because it is assumed that the woman's position is less credible than a man's, because they believe women are more emotional and therefore more unreliable than men. This is not true, but this is a bias, it's a perception, and it's very common. But this very bias, which usually harms women, also harms men when they are victims of abuse. Since men are assumed to be less emotional and stronger by virtue of their gender, when they claim to be a victim of abuse or acknowledge the need for help, they are judged oftentimes as weak, or they are discredited or completely dismissed. Often their very manhood is questioned because they have allowed themselves to be abused. This same cultural bias makes it exceedingly difficult for a male victim of abuse to speak up, as many men internalize these stereotypes, causing them to feel a lot of shame for being in the position of a victim. Internally, they may believe they should have been stronger and they should have been able to control the situation, and that their weakness caused them to be a victim. So they feel shame for being weak, and therefore they reason that the abuse is their fault and they don't deserve to be helped. Or perhaps they believe they should be able to help themselves and don't understand why they can't. Because many people assume men to always be the abuser, a man's claims of being abused are more likely to be seen as disingenuous or false. Many things contribute to this stereotype. For example, much of the literature in the field of domestic violence refers to victims exclusively as female and males exclusively as the abuser. And although statistically speaking, more females are, like I said, victims of abuse than males, it remains true that men are also victims. So how does this make them feel? When we're constantly referring to abusers as male and victims as female, it creates both a spoken and unspoken assumption that harms male victims. It also further isolates those male victims who may be unable to see any safe space for them to disclose the abuse they're experiencing and to receive the help that they need, because they feel that they will be discriminated against or not believed in a myriad of other things. But here at the Men Project, we've noticed that men will usually not comment publicly on our social media posts or blogs. Instead, they will send comments by private message. They are so tired of the stigma associated with being a male victim of abuse that they simply do not want to open themselves up to more criticism. Moreover, many suffer significantly as they're unable to find the appropriate help, because most resources in domestic violence field are for women only. So male victims often can't find appropriate resources to help them heal. And we've had a significant number of men confidentially seek our help to find male-focused support for victims of abuse. And also, when they do seek help, they are doubly abused. They experience double abuse, which we'll discuss a little bit more in detail in a minute. But before we leave that point for now, abused men instinctively know that if they experience disbelief, or if they know that they're not going to be believed when they attempt to reach out for help, it will add another layer of trauma on top of the original abuse they're already experiencing. And they know that, and any traumatized victim wants to desperately guard against more trauma. So that also causes them to shut down. I don't want to take away from that point, but it's also important for me to share that oftentimes the real abuser in a violent relationship falsely claims to be the victim and alleges their partner is the one causing the harm. This is a classic tactic of image management, and image management is one of the pillars of abusive individuals: image management, entitlement, and a faulty belief system. So if we take this tactic of image management where they claim to be the victim, these abusers utilize this victim stance to shift the attention away from them and place it on their partner with the goal of making the victim appear to be the crazy and abusive one. This is called playing the victim. That's actually the term. So while we need to be aware of this tactic, which can be used by either female or male abusers, and learn how to identify the real victim of abuse, which you will learn in our training, this does not mean men cannot and are not victims of abuse. In fact, like I said, and I just want to reiterate, 1 in 7 men are victims of domestic violence. All of this is why it's so important to learn how to recognize the signs of trauma and indicators of abuse so that you can become more equipped to help male or female victims of abuse. You'll be able to identify who's telling the truth. We'll teach you ways to really discern how to come to an understanding. So the Men Project training can really help significantly, and we hope you'll consider registering for the class that begins on March 28th. Or learn more about it on our website at themenproject.com. Okay, so now gender bias, how does it impact female victims? Let's move to how gender biases impact the woman. Let's take a look at some common biases affecting women. Women are frequently viewed as weaker, less emotionally stable, less rational than men, they're not linear thinkers. They're not pragmatic thinkers, supposedly. They are overly emotional. They're incorrectly often presumed to even lie more readily and to exaggerate their circumstances in order to gain attention from others. In some ethnicities, men are given greater power than women, and men are considered the sole leader of the family, which often fosters abuse against women. And the same is true in certain faith-based cultures, where women are expected to submit, irregardless of the level of compassion or integrity that the male partner is displaying. In some environments, when women disagree with their partner, they are seen as stubborn or simply refusing to submit, rather than being viewed as someone with a valuable individuality, a valuable point of view, or equal position in life. They are often seen as not even being capable of physical abuse or aggressive actions. So women are also perceived to be more likely victims of abuse. But it's a catch-22. They're perceived as being victims, but then when victims come out and share their story, they're not believed because they're over-complaining, over-sensitive, over-emotional. So they can't win. Some of the ways this might adversely affect a female victim of abuse are obvious. When women share the harmful patterns of, for example, covert emotional abuse with others, such as mean-spirited joking, or when they're minimized by their partner, or they're falsely blamed by their partner, those responding to them out of an unconscious gender bias might decide that they are being overly sensitive, they're exaggerating or seeking attention, rather than recognizing the behaviors that they are experiencing and that they are disclosing as being, in fact, abusive. Covert emotional abuse is a form of domestic violence. All of these responses, the responses that come out of incorrect gender bias, result in the disclosure of abuse being dismissed or disregarded or not taken as seriously or not considered real. So often responders assume the female victim is lying and they may harshly criticize or condemn the victim for the deception that is wrongly assumed. And this often happens in friend groups where they've never seen the abuser be abusive, because most abusers are very careful to not display those behaviors in public, and they only carry them out behind closed doors. And so then when the victim comes forward, they think, well, that can't possibly be, you're lying because I've never seen that person be abusive. But before I give you a statistic, we see this happen all the time on the news when abuse allegations against public figures take place. The reality is studies show only a very small percentage, 3% of victims lie about the study actually was on sexual assault, but we can carry that over into domestic violence because it's the same thing. It's an assault on the mind or on the body. And still those unconscious of or more comfortable with their gender bias continue to dismiss women's claims about abuse, assuming they are lying or overreacting. And all of these responses shut women victims down at a time that they are in most need of support, of connection, of compassion and healing. And when they are shut down, it exacerbates their trauma. So it's really a double abuse. It's a double whammy on their psyche and on their traumatic symptoms. Like male victims, these negative stereotypes about women are often embedded within female victims themselves. Just like we talked about how male victims might perceive themselves as being weak. They're blaming themselves. Women victims do the same thing, making them, they doubt their own reality about the circumstances based on these stereotypical beliefs about women. So when you've been taught by your culture or environment of your upbringing to believe the false narrative about women, you unconsciously believe them to be true at some intrinsic level. So when a woman is damaged by someone's abusive behaviors, they might question whether they are overreacting, or whether they might question whether they're being oversensitive or too emotional. I mean, this is something victims do. They automatically go to self-doubt. They're empathic, so they're willing to blame themselves. And so these stereotypes, these biases that are entrenched in our culture impact the way they self-doubt themselves. So when a woman is, so let me say it this way. In response, they shut down or dismiss their experience and silently remain in the abusive relationship, or they try to heal in isolation and not confide in anyone because they're so confused and they're trying to work it out, trying to process everything out. But what they really need is connection and support. So to be sure, their abuser is counting on this response. and is encouraging the victim's self-doubt, which only emphasizes this mindset of self-blame. Because the effect of unconscious gender bias is so damaging to victims of abuse, it is essential that we take some time to examine ourselves and honestly take stock of the biases that we have. We all have them. So I'm not saying this in judgment. I'm saying when you feel something uncomfortable in you, or you make an assumption and you think that you are all knowing and know a situation, it's really important to really be in touch with your thoughts and your feelings so that you can question yourself and say, is this accurate? Why do I feel this way before I even know the whole story? What's going on here? Really question yourself, because those biases can negatively affect others. And cultural gender biases and stereotypes impact our perception of others and our responses to them. I mean, this tangibly materializes. So we need to let go of gender biases which cause harm, or at a minimum, set our presumptions aside so that we can see and hear victims of abuse without passing judgment upon them or harming them even more. And that's a challenge because we don't even realize what our biases are in most cases. It really requires being uncomfortable and taking some time to self-examine. After considering some of the ways that gender biases affect both male and female victims of abuse, I would like to acknowledge how gender bias also impacts abusers, so the ones who are causing harm. First, though, it's essential to recognize how impactful it is for both abuser and victim when others confront the abuser about and hold them accountable for their harmful abusive actions. Through a measured and courageous confrontation, educated and caring responders, family members, friends, spiritual leaders, counselors, are in the best position to help an abuser recognize that their actions are harming others, more than lawyers, more than police officers or judges, which those first responder personnel do play a role, and it can be very helpful. But what really makes an abuser, what has a greater opportunity, it doesn't make them, but it'll prompt some abusers to self-examine, is when their family and friends make them feel that their behaviors are socially unacceptable. Remember I said that the pillars of abuse are image management. One of them is image management. They care a lot about image management. And so when society in their immediate circles disapproves of them, it can often have an effect to cause, I'm not going to say often, I'm going to take that back because a lot of abusers choose not to change. But for those that are willing to, it can be a prompt to incite a positive response that we want, which is self-reflection. Bear in mind, I want to emphasize, statistically speaking, most abusers will not be willing or able to do the hard work required to overcome their faulty beliefs, their faulty thinking, their sense of entitlement, their image management. It's just too many entrenched feelings and beliefs, ideals that they will be able to overcome without years of hard work. So they just give up, or they won't bother trying, or they don't see any need to change because it's been working for them. But many abusers are never given the chance because they are rarely, if ever, confronted by those who are in the best position to do so. Gender bias often stops responders from confronting abusers. And this is how gender bias is a disservice to abusers who need healing. You know, they need healing too. They're broken individuals. And I'm not prioritizing abusers over victims because victims are experiencing trauma, and that's always a priority. Those symptoms are significantly harmful. And so we want to give priority to a victim. But anyways, this is how gender bias is a disservice to abusers who need healing. When we carry out these biases, when we dismiss the victim's claims and refuse to call out abuse, we fail to provide the abuser with the greatest chance of recovery, accountability through meaningful confrontation. And likewise, when we assume the victim is lying because she's female or that the abuser couldn't possibly be an abuser, the abuser then becomes emboldened in their faulty thinking, believing others are in agreement with them. So see how image management can play this way too. The society around him, this inner circle of social friends, can disbelieve the victim, which then makes the abuser think they are correct in their behaviors, because oftentimes they don't realize they're being abusive. They believe they're entitled to this kind of control, that it's just their role. And so when others don't confront them, it actually can embolden their abusive actions. And then the victim is even doubly harmed by having a more intense abuse come from the abuser, in addition to the double abuse that he or she received from friends. And so then the abuser is even less likely to ever find a pathway to change. When bystanders choose to be silent, they fail to offer the abuser an opportunity to learn that their behavior is socially unacceptable and it's actually causing harm. Former abusers we have interviewed attest to the fact that they didn't realize they were being abusive until someone was able to help them understand how their words and actions were harmful. And although there is only a very small percentage of abusers who will make the necessary change to become healthy, this matters for those who will. Okay, so gender bias and double abuse. Let me address that. At the M3ND Project, we discuss cultural biases as a starting point for growth for responders of abuse. Much of what we have discussed today informs us on how to make sure we respond well to victims of abuse and confront those who are causing harm. So I am not going to go into this much more, as we have already discussed the way gender biases compel harmful responses. But briefly, I want to share more about double abuse, why it is so important for me that I coined this term and trademarked it, because double abuse is so harmful and it didn't have a name before. And it's a very real phenomenon. So please know that we're only going to be able to touch on the surface of this topic of double abuse today, because we're running out of time. But I urge you to sign up for our training that starts next week, where we will go in greater significant depth into double abuse and what it looks like, what you can do to prevent it, and all of those things. And so I urge you to sign up and visit our registration. Okay, so double abuse is really when victims finally find the courage, and it usually takes significant time after years of abuse in many cases, when they finally find the courage to either speak out or reach out for help. They are often, like I said before, they're not believed, or they're criticized, or they're judged. Like, why do you stay then? Why? And others will judge them for leaving. I can't believe you could abandon your marriage. Things of that nature. They get judged on both sides of the coin, or they're interrogated harshly. Well, have you tried this? Well, you must have done that. Well, why didn't you do this in response? Just these kinds of interrogating questions increase anxiety. And when you increase anxiety in a victim, you're increasing trauma. And so double abuse increases trauma. In fact, double abuse, most victims of long-term domestic violence, even if it's long-term emotional abuse and not physical violence, they develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And many of them don't realize that they have PTSD. And PTSD affects their cognition. It causes fragmented thinking and confusion and extreme emotion. It could be an emotional outburst, or it can be that they withdraw and are completely numb and silent and disconnect. They dissociate from their feelings. It has a lot, I could go into this so much more, but it has a lot of emotional and physiological effects on a victim. Trauma does, PTSD. And when they go through double abuse, it's almost uniformly true that their PTSD will be exacerbated into complex PTSD, which is much more complicated and much more difficult to heal. And we do go into that in our in our curriculum, in our training that I hope you will join us for. So I you can also explore this on our website where we talk about it a little bit more. But today we're out of time. So I want to just move on and say that in our close, I would love to take time for any questions you may have. Feel free to drop them into the chat at this time or raise your hand, and you can ask it live.
Okay, Annette, we have a question here.
Okay.
The question is, this is an issue I see a lot in a lot of workplaces and institutions that I'm involved in. Excuse me. What is the best way to open their eyes to the issue of gender bias?
Oh boy. Well, what I would do now, each culture is different. Some are so entrenched, there's honestly nothing you can do. It's so embedded at every level. The culture is so embedded that you would have to fire everybody and hire new people because it's just too tall a task to influence that many people that are embedded in the different layers of that institution. But what I would do is I would go to the HR department and talk about how you're experiencing these gender biases, and that you think it would be really beneficial and enlightening for everyone to experience a class on gender bias, and see if your HR department will support having training to all of its personnel. And the other thing is, you can, as long as you're not in the midst of a conflict, I don't recommend in the midst of a conflict to blurt out, this is gender bias. You might want to go to HR and document the situation, send them an email so that you have a paper trail, and send that to HR, and then talk to them about an specific experience that you have. But I was going to say that in a non-conflict situation, if you have a good relationship with any patriarchs, men in the situation, you would have to use your own judgment, but I would talk openly about how you can ask them, what do you feel about that? What do you believe? And if they're super closed-minded and entrenched, I just personally would not have high expectations that you can change them. It's possibly more what's the word I'm trying to say? Advantageous to change employment and go someplace where the culture is different, where they have ongoing trainings and where they're really proactive about cultural biases and gender biases.
So good. Thank you, Annette. And there's a follow-up to that. Is there a way they could suggest, like, our organization make an introduction to our organization is basically the question. I rephrased it a little bit because you kind of addressed some of it here.
Certainly. I mean, when we train an organization, we always spend significant time researching their culture. We talk to the people on the ground and really glean information about troubled areas, areas where they need to evolve more. And we try to customize our training to focus on some of their own cultural shortcomings or recurring problems from a cultural perspective, so that we can make our training, which we don't change the content the points that we want to make, but we use hypotheticals and we use interactive time to address some of those cultural challenges that they're facing within that community. So yes, absolutely reach out to us.
Great. We have 2 more questions here. And so one of them is, you mentioned that the abuser often doesn't recognize that he or she is being abusive. In a case where family and friends are fully aware that the abuser is being emotionally abusive, what can the abused do to encourage them to intervene?
Oh, this is really tough because most people are cowards, I have to just say, to be totally frank. However, a lot of people are afraid to intervene because they don't want to, they don't automatically know that the victim wants them to intervene. They're afraid it's going to make matters worse. So it's really important for you to give them permission and actually tell them, it would be really helpful when you see my partner behaving in a certain way that you just say, whoa, ouch, that was harsh. I don't like how you just spoke to her or him. I don't know. But I would encourage them to just address it in the moment. And if they say, no, I'm not going to, I would just implore upon them that you can't do it alone, that you need intervention. And when people just stand by and shut down and allow it to happen, they're basically colluding in the abuse, giving that person permission, and it actually makes that person, it emboldens their behaviors, and even more abuse comes your way. So it would be helpful. And I would just plead to that, but I would be really careful, because when people reject you, when you're already traumatized, it is another form of double abuse. It will trigger you in a way that could be overwhelming. And I just want you to guard your heart and guard your mind and your well-being, and just only ask this of people that you feel you can trust. But maybe just take baby steps in the conversation before you fully invest in a holistic conversation, because if you just take baby steps, you will be able to temper their kind of response so that you don't fully invest something and get a huge rejection. You're just taking little steps and following the cues. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really, really good. I'm glad you made that note, because that would be really more traumatic.
Yeah.
Take a big step. And yeah, I like how you suggest doing it in just baby steps, and even doing it publicly and recommending that they make the comment, just as a comment rather than a real confrontation in the abuser's face. Like,
Yeah.
just something that you observed, I saw you say
Yep.
that. I like that a lot, Annette. Thank you. And then
And
there's
especially when they make a comment in front of a group of people like that, it helps in that image management department. It helps them realize that their behavior is not socially acceptable and they're being challenged on it.
Yeah, and it's not unnoticed. People are,
Yeah, it's noticed. It's not unnoticed.
yeah, very good. The final question we have is, what's the best way to advocate for yourself as a victim of abuse when you feel like someone is harming you from a place of bias?
When you feel like someone's harming you from a place of bias, well, if somebody is doubly abusing you already, they're probably not the safest person to confront. Although I have heard many stories where friends have inadvertently doubly abused, and when the victim really sat down and explained it for them, or had them listen to one of our intensives, for example, to help educate them, they were able to break through and get the connection and comfort that they were really seeking. But again, I would walk this rope gingerly, taking baby steps, because if someone is already rejecting you and doubly abusing you, they could be so entrenched in their thinking. And when you then confront them, they could be so defensive Many people are not able to tolerate their own defenses. They're not able to tolerate being challenged or having someone say, this really hurt me. They just are emotionally underdeveloped. And so they react. So when people are emotionally not fully mature, they tend to be the ones that are over emotional. That's why abusers are over emotional, because they're emotionally immature. So they emote uncontrolled emotions. And that's could be something that you experience when you address how something is harming you, if somebody is going to be on the defensive. So I just want you to be careful, but I would probably have them listen to one of our intensives that's directly, maybe this intensive, for example, which will be available on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. Sometimes it helps when they hear somebody else speak into them. We all are influenced by others when we learn, we take a class, we read a book, and so it might be more influential if they learn about this from experts in the field rather than you yourself. Just a thought.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, that's it so far. I guess that's it for questions, so we can probably wrap up.
Okay, well, I want to thank all of you for being here and encourage you to join our curriculum. I would love to have you there. And the signups, it's closing out very soon. So please do that in a prompt fashion so you don't miss out. We'd love to see you. And thank you so much. Until next time, have a great day.